13th of November 1942, Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. Captain Tamichi Hara of the Imperial Japanese Navy squinted against the glare. The darkness had disappeared, engulfed by an endless string of explosions. Searchlights crossed the sky, cannons roared incessantly, and the American shells fell like rain. "They are not aiming," he noted in his diary that morning. "They're just filling the sky with metal." That observation was not just an outburst, it was a diagnosis. An empire built on discipline and limitation faced an adversary who shot as if ammunition were infinite, because it was. While Japan distributed capsules sparingly, the United States fired with method, volume, and automatic replacement. That was no longer artillery, it was mass production. This is not a story of bravery, but of arithmetic. A story not about heroes who shot, but about factories that never stopped producing. A war won not on the battlefields, but in the ammunition depots of Nebraska. Over the course of this investigation, it will be revealed how the Japanese doctrine of economics collapsed in the face of the American logic of excess, and how for many, the war ended at the moment when the last Japanese capsule needed to be spared. But before we dive into the accounts and testimonies of those who lived through this unequal war, there is a statistic that defines everything that will be said next. While Japan melted 8th century Buddhist bells to melt ammunition capsules, the United States produced 47 billion shells. In just 1 month, a single American facility produced more ammunition than all of Japan in a year of total war. And at its peak, the difference wasn't just numerical, it was civilizational. This video is a behind-the-scenes dive into that disparity. If you value history with data, context, and respect for detail, please support this project with a like and apply. This is how we continue to bring to light the stories that the dust of the archives tried to hide. By 1937, Japanese naval doctrine had already consolidated a philosophy of war based not on unlimited force projection, but on mandatory precision. The battles that would come would, in the view of the Imperial Navy General Staff, be decided in short, violent, and resolute confrontations, battles that would save resources precisely because they were decisive. At its core, the doctrine was an equation. A technically superior, well-trained fleet with disciplined gunners and counted ammunition would win by quality, not quantity. This belief was reinforced by decades of samurai tradition transposed to naval logic. Spend wisely, hit with honor. Each Japanese destroyer was instructed to fire in bursts of 3 to 5 rounds. The anti-aircraft gunners were to wait until the enemy planes were 800 yards away. The use of ammunition was monitored as a strategic variable. There was no room for error. And most importantly, there was no room for wrong assumption. The problem was precisely there. The Japanese doctrine was based on the premise that all countries were subject to the same limitation. Factories with modest capacity, calculated inventories, restricted logistics. The reasoning was logical, if applied to Japan. But it completely ignored the American reality. At Pearl Harbor, the initial euphoria masked what would soon become evident. It wasn't just a fleet difference, it was a difference in the industrial ecosystem. While Japanese officials calculated whether they could unleash 12 rounds per cannon on an escort mission, the USS San Francisco on Guadalcanal fired more than 1,000 rounds in a single night. In the after-action report, Japanese Captain Hara coldly described what his eyes witnessed. They weren't aiming. They were just turning the sky into fire. This was not an isolated episode. The logic of the counted shot shaped everything from the training exercises to the planning of the missions. The ammunition stocks of an aircraft carrier like the Shokaku were sufficient for a maximum of 12 minutes of continuous anti-aircraft fire. That was why gunners were trained not to shoot. It wasn't a technical luxury, it was a tactical necessity. Commander Masatake Okumiya himself, a veteran of several naval operations, would later report that the exercises were rehearsed so sparingly that many crew members went into combat without ever having made an actual firing sequence. The Americans, as would be revealed later, trained by firing tens of thousands of projectiles per operator. What's more, each mistake was a justification for more ammunition, not less. The Japanese doctrine, which aimed at economics, ended up educating men to hesitate, and hesitating in war costs more than any capsule saved. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the executive officer of the aircraft carrier Shokaku, Commander Tishi Nato, observed something that broke the logic that underpinned his entire formation. He reported to American interrogators after the war that U.S. destroyers and cruisers maintained sustained anti-aircraft fire for nearly 4 hours non-stop, and apparently without concern for consumption. The account included an almost skeptical passage. Each destroyer seemed to carry more ammunition than our entire division put together. In a single operation, the doctrine of the counted shot, which was born out of the physical limitation of Japanese industry, had become an operational myth. A truth that no one questioned anymore, not even in the face of reality. And the reality was brutal. The Hastings base in the state of Nebraska initially produced 100,000 naval munitions per month. At its peak, it exceeded 300,000. The whole of Japan, with all its arsenals combined, did not reach 400,000 rounds of ammunition per annum. At this point in the narrative, it is worth inviting the attentive viewer. If this statistic surprised you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what the numbers show. But if Japanese doctrine assumed that combat would be fast, that ammunition should be rationed, and that accuracy would win out over excess, how to explain that the Americans won even if they made mistakes? The answer lies in the volume. In modern naval warfare, missing wasn't the problem, as long as you could miss 1,000 times in a minute and keep shooting. The Americans had understood that the war was no longer a duel between knights. It was a production race, a cadence competition. Whoever fired the most, even without aiming, dominated the field. Each projectile was an attempt, each attempt a psychological pressure, each pressure a break in the enemy's morale. Captain Hara described this with irony. After the Battle of the Java Sea, in which the Japanese tactically defeated a poorly coordinated Allied force, he noted, "They fired as if they had infinite ammunition," and they did. The British cruiser HMS Exeter, sunk in that battle, had fired more than 1,500 8-inch shells, more than any Japanese heavy cruiser could carry. And even though he missed most of the shots, the moral impact was clear. The Japanese began to understand that they were not just facing a fleet, they were facing a machine. This pattern would repeat itself in battle after battle. Japanese officers saw the American guns glowing red, the skies converted to artificial clarity, the continuous roar of gunfire. But even in the face of this, they continued to be bound by the doctrine of containment. Japanese artillery, while technically efficient, could not compete with statistics. Volume replaced marksmanship, saturation replaced surgical adjustment. The war turned into an equation of tonnage, gunpowder, and railroad tracks. But the most telling thing was yet to come. Because the doctrine of the counted shot was not just a technical limitation, it was a direct reflection of Japan's productive capacity. And to understand why the Japanese had to count each capsule, one has to look at where and how the Americans produced theirs. The next chapter will take us to the heart of Hastings, Nebraska, a facility built on flat prairies with more miles of track than many Japanese cities. There, ammunition was shaped by shift, packed by thousands, and sent by train as if it were grain. And there, in the mechanical silence of the factories, the war was already being won, even before the first shot was fired. At the same time that Japanese officers were calibrating their sights so as not to waste a single shell, American ships were adopting an opposite philosophy, deliberately opposite. The doctrine of the United States Navy, forged in the logic of industrial production and the comfort of infinite supply, was the doctrine of saturation. It was not a matter of reaching a specific point with surgical precision, but of transforming space into a field of impossibility. The goal was simple and brutal, to make the sky and the sea impassable by any enemy. Artillery was not used for aiming, it was used to deny the existence of entire areas. Each destroyer, equipped with 5 5-inch guns, could fire 15 rounds per minute per gun, 75 shells per minute per ship. Each 40mm Bofors mount, standard across the fleet, fired 120 rounds per minute. The 20mm mounts, aimed at point defense, could exceed 450 shots per minute. In combined operations, a battle formation could, and often did, release hundreds of thousands of shells in a few hours. It was a storm of steel and fire, not intended to hit directly, but to prevent any possibility of approach. This approach was not just tactical, it was philosophical. The mistake, for the Americans, was irrelevant when volume replaced aim. A lost Japanese missile could mean failure. An American shot missed was just part of a sequence that, in its repetition, would guarantee the hit by pure statistics. It was the end of precision warfare and the beginning of yield warfare. This logic of saturation was not born only of an aggressive doctrine. It was born of absolute trust in the rear. The American gunners fired with fury because they knew that days later, ships of ammunition would appear on the horizon with enough replacement to repeat everything. The feeling of abundance created an uninhibited form of combat. The reports of artillery operators confirm this. Gunners of the USS New Jersey, for example, recalled that shooting was like breathing. Gunfire was heard during practice shifts, during moving target exercises, and also during actual combat. No change in cadence, no hesitation. A mistake was solved with more shots. A difficult target was suppressed with more volume. If the Japanese doctrine was based on the expectation of decisive confrontations, the American one transformed the war into constant attrition. The goal was to exhaust the enemy before it even approached. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, this philosophy reached its maximum expression. American cruisers, destroyers, and battleships created veritable walls of anti-aircraft fire. The reports of Japanese pilots rescued after the attacks are unanimous. There was no room to fly. One of the survivors, a pilot on the aircraft carrier Taiho, described his last mission as flying straight to hell. It was not shot down by a missile, but by a cloud of projectiles that exploded in all directions, creating an environment of destruction in which survival was a matter of luck. The pilots no longer tried to aim, just to fly through the curtain of fire, hoping they wouldn't be hit. The difference between aiming at an airplane and turning the entire sky into death wasn't just a matter of tactics. It was material proof that Americans could do whatever they wanted with their firepower. This doctrine turned each ship into a mobile fortress, but also an extension of the factories that supplied it. The concept of the front line dissolved. A destroyer fired on Guadalcanal, but the projectiles it used had been produced weeks earlier in Oklahoma, transported by rail to shore, loaded onto specialized freighters, transferred to ammunition ships, and delivered on the high seas under fire. None of this would have been possible without the uninterrupted logistics that underpinned the doctrine of abundance. When the USS Fletcher conducted gunnery drills during the same week that Japanese destroyers risked everything to deliver a few drums of ammunition to Guadalcanal, the irony became apparent. While one side fired routinely, the other carried ammunition as if transporting blood to a terminally ill patient. American logic was so aggressive that each new type of weapon was developed with a focus on cadence. Fire control systems, such as the Mark 37, allowed the guns to be operated by radar, even in conditions of low visibility. This eliminated the interval between sighting the target and firing. There was no more hesitation. And when proximity fuses came into use, a technology that exploded the projectile as it approached the target without direct contact, the doctrine of saturation achieved unparalleled lethality. It was no longer necessary to get it right. It was enough to get close. The difference between error and success at this point had been completely erased. In the eyes of the Japanese, the American artillery looked insane. They saw shots being fired at unrecommended distances with cadences that would make any Japanese doctrinaire declare the operator incompetent. But what the Japanese called waste, the Americans called superiority, and this semantic difference translated into tactical results. The American units were more aggressive because they knew that their mistakes would not be penalized with scarcity. The confidence to shoot more made maneuvers possible that, in any other navy, would have been suicidal. But suicide had changed sides. With each Japanese advance, a storm of lead awaited them, not because the Americans wanted to stop that particular plane, but because they decided to stop any plane. This doctrine was not limited to anti-aircraft warfare. In direct naval engagements, the logic remained. In the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the cruiser USS Helena fired 6-inch shells at such a high rate that Japanese observers believed they were automatic weapons, something that did not even exist at that time for this caliber. The impression was that the ship was firing like a machine gun, turning the skies into a continuous field of explosions. Within minutes, the Helena had fired more ammunition than many Japanese destroyers carried for an entire mission. The doctrine of saturation was thus the practical projection of an industry without limits. It did not depend on tactical genius, nor on ingenious maneuvers. It was enough to be present in sufficient numbers for long enough. The enemy could have discipline, courage, and precision. But against a sky that explodes, all this becomes irrelevant. And what the Japanese did not imagine was that while one ship fired non-stop, other ships, invisible, silent, were already approaching loaded with more ammunition, ready to replace every last spent projectile. But to understand how this replacement was possible, it is necessary to leave the battlefield and look behind the scenes. In the heart of the American plains, entire factories operated at a cadence as steady as the cannons they fueled. Hastings, Nebraska; Crane, Indiana. Places unknown to most soldiers, but which defined the fate of all of them. In the next chapter, we'll look at how a factory built in the middle of nowhere transformed the concept of war, and why, by 1943, the United States was already producing more ammunition per month than Japan was producing all year rounds. In the American Midwest, far from the Pacific front lines, anonymous cities have become invisible fortresses. Hastings, Nebraska; Crane, Indiana. Places with no military tradition, no strategic glamour, but which carried the weight of a global war on their backs. They were factory cities, built from scratch, expanded in weeks, connected by hundreds of miles of track, and stocked with resources no other country could match. Hastings, for example, operated 24 hours a day with rotating shifts, 13,000 employees, and the capacity to produce more than 40,000 tons of ammunition per month. Alone, it produced more than the entire Japanese archipelago. The pace was industrial, but the impact was military. Every shell produced there wasn't just molten metal, it was a statistical line on the victory chart. Production conveyors replaced battles, and each capsule rejected due to inspection failure, something common in the Hastings lines, was still of higher quality than many shells in use by Japanese forces at the front. The operation was designed with logistical precision. Exclusive trains carried raw materials and removed ready-made ammunition. The factory's rail network was larger than that of some European cities. Internal tracks moved wagons between the 220 buildings in the complex, Each sector was responsible for one stage: casting, assembly, ballistic testing, packaging. Errors were corrected in minutes, production was continuous and standardized. The speed with which a replacement order for capsules was processed, packaged, and shipped bordered on the time it took a Japanese official to receive authorization to use some of the existing stockpile. The difference was not just material, it was temporal. The Americans operated in advance, the Japanese are late. Crane, Indiana, followed a similar logic. Specializing in high-precision ammunition, with a focus on fuses, and electrical components, Crane's plant symbolized another decisive factor: the integration between civilian industry and military effort. There, engineers from GE, Westinghouse, and RCA cooperated directly with Navy officials. There was no bureaucracy, there was mission. The line between engineer and combatant has disappeared. Every technical detail, from the chemical composition of the explosives to the type of waterproof packaging, was tested and optimized by civilians who understood that a day's delay could cost hundreds of lives on the other side of the world. But perhaps most symbolic was the fact that these factories did not stop growing. Hastings started with 200 hectares. In 2 years, it doubled in size. It added new sheds, new cafeterias, daycare centers, cinemas, recreation centers. War became the rhythm of the city. The bell of the shift change was the heartbeat of American victory. At its peak, Hastings produced a capsule every 4 seconds. In 1 hour, more ammunition than Japan produced in an entire day. What the strategists of the Japanese General Staff never understood is that the Americans didn't just shoot a lot, they had a place to do it all over and over again, with margin of error, surplus, and replacement. American ammunition was also a product of extreme quality control. Each capsule underwent balance, weight, seal, and performance tests. Inventories were monitored with statistical systems. Expired shells were discarded. In Japan, capsules from previous decades have returned to use due to lack of replacement. Some failed, others exploded prematurely. There have been recorded cases where Japanese guns have exploded by using degraded ammunition. The difference between rejecting a projectile and accepting anyone was more than technique. She was philosophical. It was the difference between being able to choose and being forced to accept. The U.S. produced so much that it could afford to reject its own excellence. In addition, the distribution structure was integrated into the naval effort. So-called ammunition ships, specialized freighters with segmented trunks, crews trained to operate at risk of detonation, and offshore transfer systems, carried the capsules from Nebraska to the Pacific without interruption. A molten capsule 12,000 kilometers away arrived on the deck of a destroyer with precise tracking, delivered by hands that had never seen the ocean. But even so, they decided the course of sea battles. It was the victory of production over presence. The factory had become the greatest weapon of war in the United States, and none of this would have been possible without economies of scale. The ammunition was standardized. The factories did not create capsules for specific ships, but for universal systems. The same 5-inch projectile was used for dozens of ships, facilitating logistics, reducing errors, and speeding up deliveries. Standardization reduced costs, increased speed, and built resilience. If one factory was destroyed, another took over. If a ship changed missions, it carried the same shells. While the Japanese organized stocks according to the demands of each fleet, the Americans designed ammunition as if designing car parts, in series, in rhythm, at scale. This model has become standard. By 1944, the U.S. maintained 78 industrial facilities dedicated solely to the production of naval and air ammunition. On average, each produced more than 2 million units per month. Japan had 5 main facilities, none of them with a capacity close to that. When Japanese intelligence discovered Hastings' existence, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration. One officer even wrote that It is not possible to have a city that produces projectiles at the pace of agricultural harvesting. But it was possible, and there was. The war that the Japanese imagined fighting no longer existed. They were fighting moving walkways and night shifts, against logistical matrices and invisible rails. And at the heart of that revolution was a strategic lesson. Winning a modern war was no longer about having better soldiers. It was about having more capsules faster, more accurately. It was about turning the factory into the real arsenal of the battlefield. But what happened when this industrial production was put to the test in extreme environments, when logistics were pushed to the limit and yet surpassed everything the Japanese could achieve with risk, sacrifice, and destruction? The answer lay in the metal drums thrown into the sea and in the suicide mission of destroyers that brought liquid hope to hungry soldiers. Because even with all the Japanese heroism, the result was always the same. Ammunition was never enough. And the drums, they almost never arrived. Beginning in August 1942, the Japanese High Command began one of the most dramatic logistical operations of the entire war, the so-called Tokyo Express, a grandiose name for a desperate operation. With airfields under constant bombardment and American air superiority growing, the only way to supply the 15,000 troops stranded on Guadalcanal was by sea, and at night. The method seemed improvised, but it was the only option. 8 destroyers sailed at high speed to the coast, in total darkness, carrying metal drums full of supplies. Each drum was pushed overboard with a buoy and a dim light so that the Marines could rescue by hand. It was a maneuver of precision and risk. On one of the missions, the destroyer Kagero transported 300 drums of ammunition and food for an entire division. Each drum carried the equivalent of 20 minutes of fire from a single American ship. The logistical cost was absurdly disproportionate. What Japan risked with 8 ships, the US wasted on training exercises. In one night, hundreds of lives were put on the line to deliver what for Americans was a gunnery practice session. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It didn't take courage. It took a factory. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts buried by the dust of war, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you more content with this level of research. The outcome of the Tokyo Express operation was tragic. On average, less than half of the drums arrived intact on the beach. The rest sank, got lost in the current, or were destroyed by American coastal artillery fire. Even when the drums were recovered, they were often unusable. The ammunition was soaked. The rice, moldy. It was like trying to put out a fire with a dropper. In the Japanese Army's secret report number 17, read only by high-ranking officers, a paragraph summed up the bankruptcy. We spend more fuel and steel per ton delivered to Guadalcanal than on any other front, and even so our soldiers have nothing to eat. The Tokyo Express operation, far from being a symbol of efficiency, came to represent the desperation of an empire without a rearguard. Logistics ceased to be a means and became the battlefield itself. Meanwhile, the Americans used cargo ships such as the USS Rainier to deliver at once 7,500 tons of ammunition, the equivalent of more than 100,000 drums. On a trip, no battle, no risk. Only with rails, engines, and planning. But Japan's logistical collapse didn't just manifest itself in the numbers. It eroded morale, paralyzed offensives, and turned every Japanese soldier into a capsule counter. And as we shall see below, this material scarcity would soon turn into psychological scarcity, when even the most experienced officers hesitated to pull the trigger, fearing that this would be their last shot. In the early hours of August 9, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy achieved one of its most impressive victories of World War II, the Battle of Savo Island. In just 32 minutes, a Japanese task force consisting of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, the USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra. It was an almost perfect operation. Night attack, radio silence, masterful use of Type 93 torpedoes, and precise coordination. The American team was taken completely by surprise. The sea lit up with fires, and hundreds of Allied sailors died without even understanding what had hit them. In the eyes of the world, it was a display of tactical mastery. But for the Japanese themselves, the victory brought a bitter taste. At the end of the engagement, Admiral Mikawa decided not to go any further to destroy the U.S. transports anchored on Guadalcanal, a vulnerable fleet essential to the Allied landing. The decision caused perplexity. Why not finish the victory? Why retreat in the face of defenseless targets? The answer was simple and devastating. Their ships did not have enough ammunition. The Japanese fleet had used almost all of its torpedoes and shells in the first phase of the battle. Only defensive shots remained. Instead of advancing and risking a counterattack with unloaded guns, Mikawa retreated, not out of caution. By scarcity, the victory, which seemed absolute, hid an unsustainable operational reality. This was no exception. Japanese combat doctrine, focused on tactical brilliance, could not sustain prolonged offensive sequences. Their ships were designed for combat, not campaign. They had little storage capacity, and their replacement logistics were rudimentary. The heavy cruiser Chokai, for example, could carry less than 200 8-inch shells, enough for a single intense engagement. After the battle, it had to retreat for days until it refueled. An American cruiser of the New Orleans class carried more than 200 shells of the same caliber, with automated replacement systems and integrated logistical support. The difference was clear. Japan fought like a swordsman in a duel. The United States struggled like a moving foundry. This strategic contradiction was repeated at various times during the campaign. At Santa Cruz, the Japanese again inflicted significant losses, but lost the initiative because they couldn't keep pace. At Tassafaronga, they sank more ships, but retreated without consolidating their position. With each victory, a setback. With each setback, a wasted opportunity. And the cause was not tactical error, it was logistical incapacity. The shortage of ammunition not only limited offensives, but eroded the morale of commanders. Knowing that a victory could not be taken advantage of, turned each fight into a suicidal move. Meanwhile, the Americans, even when they lost ships, responded with almost immediate replacement. Did the USS Quincy sink in Savo? A few weeks later, another cruiser was already taking its place. Ammunition? It was never a problem. In campaigns such as Tarawa or Saipan, American destroyers fired more than 5,000 shells in coastal support without pause in a single operation. A volume that, for the Japanese, was equivalent to the stock of an entire squadron. The difference between keeping up the pressure and retreating was not a matter of courage, it was a matter of capsules. In post-war interviews, several Japanese officials admitted to this frustration. Commander Tamichi Kurita of the famed Center Force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf stated that many ships returned early for fear of running out of ammunition. War, in practice, was timed. Each fight had to be calculated with a minimum margin. Americans, on the other hand, could make mistakes, insist, come back, make mistakes again, because the bottom of their reserves was simply unreachable. The logic of modern warfare had changed. It was not enough to win a battle. It was necessary to sustain it, and for that, something was needed that Japan did not have, an industrial replacement system. And there was another, invisible but decisive factor, the psychological exhaustion. Japanese commanders, once confident, began to hesitate. Not because of the presence of the enemy, but because of the absence of ammunition. An internal report of the combined fleet warned that the average of fire per mission was falling, not by formal orders, but by self-censorship of the officers. The fear of wasting capsules has become an implicit doctrine. Scarcity shaped behavior. One commander was hesitant to order a bombardment, as he did not know if he would have replacement for the next engagement. This affected tactical decisions, slowed offensives, and reduced the effectiveness of engagements where initiative was everything. In the United States, the perception was the opposite. Gunners were encouraged to fire whenever there was doubt. A miscalculation was not penalized. It was corrected with more volume. The replacement came from Hastings, Crane, and dozens of other facilities operating day and night. The confidence this engendered on the battlefield was unparalleled. Sailors knew that even after days of fighting, their depots would be replenished. This didn't just maintain effectiveness, it amplified aggressiveness. Combat ceased to be an exercise of containment and became an operation of insistence. And in modern war, he who insists wins. The Battle of Savo Island, so celebrated as a Japanese feat, is now seen by many historians as the first major symptom of Japan's logistical collapse, a victory that sealed defeat. Winning a battle and abandoning the field for lack of ammunition is not just waste. It is the confession that war, as a system, is bankrupt. And as we will see in the next part, this strategic collapse would be exposed even more cruelly in November 1942, when Captain Tamichi Hara on Guadalcanal observed a continuous American bombardment and wrote, bitterly, "They are not aiming, they're just filling the sky with metal." That night would not be just another fight. It would be the final portrait of Japanese impotence in the face of an industry that did not sleep. While the United States was building industrial cities with soup kitchens, movie theaters, and daycare centers for workers, Japan was tightening the screws of its own childhood. In 1943, with the war already taking its logistical toll, the Japanese War Ministry officially authorized the mobilization of teenagers for the ammunition production effort. Children aged 12 to 16 were moved from schools to underground factories, makeshift sheds, and adapted warehouses. The working hours could reach 14 hours a day. Many worked standing up, without breaks. Some fell asleep on the benches, others fainted under the heat of the furnaces. Projectile factories, designed for adult workers, have become children's exhaustion camps. Small hands were useful for handling delicate mechanisms, but they were also more exposed to accidental explosions. Records show that in just 1 month in 1944, at the Kurashiki factory, 17 teenagers died in explosions or fires. Their bodies were buried with military honors. But the real funeral was that of strategic rationality. Japan sacrificed its youth to try to keep up with an enemy that produced more with less suffering. At the same time, Hastings operated with an inverse logic. The factory provided free food, medical care, public transportation, and even entertainment for its workers. There were movie sessions at the end of each shift, sports competitions between sectors, and flexible schedules for mothers with young children. Productivity was high not by imposition, but by comfort. Workers took turns in 3 shifts, with monitored safety and strict quality control. The environment was one of mission, but never of extreme physical sacrifice. American ammunition did not carry the sweat of childhood, but the planning of well-fed, well-paid, forward-looking adults. It was the difference between producing out of desperation and producing by system. The Japanese shortage forced increasingly symbolic measures. Ancient temples were vandalized so that their bronze bells could be melted into capsules. Buddha statues were melted down. Traditional festival drums were dismantled. The copper from the roofs of schools and libraries was stripped away to melt detonators. The war entered the rituals, the architecture, the soul of the country. But it did not enter the performance spreadsheets. All this spiritual effort could barely maintain the basic rhythm of supply. The capsules left the factories with errors, without proper sealing, and many failed the tests. But they were still sent to the ships. The doctrine had become superstition. One no longer fought with the hope of victory, but with the fear of not resisting the next day. The contradiction was visible even in the instruction manuals. The training of young Japanese workers emphasized the spirit of the projectile. Each capsule was treated as an extension of the worker's body. It should be ridden with reverence. Sweat should not fall on the metal. Many students began their shift with a ritual salute at the factory's war altar. Meanwhile, in the United States, shells were numbered products, transported by crawlers, inspected by technicians, and shipped by cranes. No mysticism, just yield. Each American capsule was part of a statistic. Each Japanese capsule was part of a penance. The human cost soon became a strategic cost. With makeshift factories, exhausted workers, and unpredictable supplies, the quality of munitions dropped. Failure rates have increased. Premature explosions, projectiles that did not detonate, clogged cannons. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, reports indicate that nearly 30% of Japanese anti-aircraft munitions did not perform as expected. By contrast, the Americans, using proximity fuse produced in factories like Crane, hit targets with unprecedented precision. It was the point at which the sacrificed childhood became a statistic of defeat. The Japanese effort, however noble, was doomed to lose, not for lack of courage, but for lack of scale. American officials who inspected Japanese factories after the surrender were surprised by the degree of improvisation. Outdated equipment, lack of spare parts, absence of standardization. Many components were assembled by hand, without exact weight control or balancing. A colonel in the U.S. Corps of Engineers stated, "They were mounting war with bamboo tongs." The phrase was symbolic. Japan faced an industry that operated with millimeter precision as it tried to maintain a war with childlike hands and rusty tools. There was no way to balance the scales. But perhaps the most brutal data is in an internal Mitsubishi report from 1945. For every 1,000 capsules delivered, about 400 were produced by underage workers. In other words, nearly half of Japan's final arsenal came from the effort of a generation that should never have known war. In Japan, ammunition had become a spiritual currency, and the price was childhood. This sacrifice, however, did not yield a strategic advantage. It just delayed the inevitable. While the United States marched efficiently toward total domination of the Pacific, Japan plunged into an abyss of scarcity where every tactical victory was bought with the health of its children. But modern warfare does not sympathize with pain. It responds to capacity, and the next part of this story reveals an element that consolidated American supremacy: the use of proximity fuses, an innovation that turned error into success and made even the heavens bow before industrial precision. In the heart of Arizona, sprawling dry fields served as the backdrop for one of the quietest weapons of American victory: training. There, gunners from ships, tanks, and aircraft underwent continuous firing sessions. Targets towed by planes, mobile turrets, maneuvering balloons, and even structures simulating enemy aircraft were part of an obsessive routine. The rule was clear: shoot until you hit. If he missed, he reloaded. If he missed again, he shot more. There was no economy. On average, each American gunner fired more than 12,000 rounds during basic training. For pilots, the number was even higher: 20,000 rounds per formation. This created a culture where mistakes did not generate punishment, it generated learning. A wrong capsule was not a waste, it was an investment. In Japan, the scenario was the opposite. A pilot in formation received about 30 rounds for machine gun training, a number that did not cover even a single combat burst. Scarcity shaped confidence. Japanese gunners had often never fired live ammunition before the first engagement. They were trained in theory, with wooden models or paper simulations. Precision depended on instinct, the right of faith. In the USA, the method was scientifically calculated. In Pensacola, Florida, training centers had optical sensors that recorded each burst and calculated the dispersion. Instructions were given based on charts. Gunners learned to measure the ideal blast distance, adjust bursts according to the caliber and speed of the target. The abundance of ammunition made it possible to simulate any scenario. A pilot trained to attack bombers, fighters, ships, and even balloons in a single day. The goal was to create reflexes, that the shot was not a thought, but a muscular response. And this repetition was only possible because the capsules were always available. A 1944 report shows that, in training exercises alone, the US consumed 2.5 billion rounds, the equivalent of Japan's entire ammunition production in 2 years of war. Pause in the narrative. This data is not a miscalculation. In training alone, the Americans used more ammunition than all of Japan produced between 1942 and 1944. If this number surprised you, comment now. Logistics wins, because this was the most ignored battlefield and the most decisive. Germany, although more technologically advanced than Japan, also underestimated this dimension. The Luftwaffe Flugzeugschulen, German aviation training centers, offered sophisticated simulations, but with limited ammunition. Many pilots practiced firing only with unloaded guns to preserve capsules. When they were finally sent to the front, they had technical mastery, but no reflexes. The enemy they were facing, however, had already fired thousands of times before engaging in combat. This unbalanced not only the aim, but the psychological. Knowing that you can make mistakes because there is more ammunition in the warehouse generates calm. Knowing that there is only one chance generates tension, and tension kills precision. The American doctrine did not romanticize the immediate settlement. It was based on repetition. Shoot, correct, shoot again. The system was so accurate that, on average, a fighter pilot could maintain a 12% hit rate in real combat, a high number, considering the dynamics of aerial duels. And this was a direct result of live ammunition training. By the end of 1943, the US Army had fired more than 3 billion rounds in simulations alone. It was a production line of hits, fed by endless capsules. This pattern was repeated in naval operations. Gunners of destroyers and cruisers underwent weekly fire-on-the-move tests. They simulated night combat, beach bombardments, and even airstrikes. Each shot was timed, evaluated, and recorded. If performance dropped, the group was put in a new round of training. No capsule was wasted, because each wrong capsule was one less mistake in the future. It was the mathematics of efficiency. While the Japanese prepared their gunners with theories of shooting economy, the Americans trained them with practices of excess. And in real war, excess wins theory. A symbolic example. In preparation for the invasion of Iwo Jima, the US Marines were given enough ammunition to conduct full landing exercises on simulated beaches, with air cover, live artillery fire, and cluster shells. Each simulation used thousands of capsules, and it was done several times. Japan, for its part, trained its defenders with wooden ammunition, hollow capsules used only for instructional purposes. In many cases, they were only given live ammunition 2 days before the fighting. The difference was not on the battlefield, it was in the before. And the before, for Americans, was an infinite factory. In addition, the US had logistical systems to deliver this training munition to any location. Military trains, cargo planes, supply ships, everything was coordinated by a distribution network designed to eliminate delays. A training center in New Mexico could order 1 million capsules and receive them within 72 hours. This continuous flow transformed the exercises into simulated battlefields with the same intensity as the real war. When the war came, the body already knew what to do. And there was a final component. The US could make mistakes. They could fail, waste, shoot without aiming, and still win. Because the basis of American power was not accuracy. It was the replacement. A Japanese pilot made a mistake and felt the weight of the mistake. Perhaps it was his only shot. An American pilot missed and reloaded. This asymmetry shaped the entire outcome of the conflict. But how did it manifest itself in the final numbers? How many shots, how many capsules, how many factories were mobilized to ensure that error no longer mattered? The answer lies behind the scenes of the largest supply chain ever created in human history, and that's what we'll see in the next part. At the height of the Pacific, while Japan calculated supply routes with rulers and clocks, the United States designed an invisible revolution: refueling on the high seas. In 1944, with the rapid expansion of amphibious campaigns, Washington authorized the creation of Service Squadron 10, a floating task force with no armament but more lethal than any battleship. It was made up of oil tankers, ammunition ships, refrigerated freighters, spare parts boats, floating workshops, and even mobile hospitals. This support network allowed carriers, destroyers, and cruisers to no longer have to return to ports to refuel. The American fleet became, for the first time in history, a self-sufficient entity. In its structure, Resupply Group 30.8 operated as the main artery. With surgical precision, it was capable of fueling up to 40 ships simultaneously on the move, transferring fuel, supplies, and ammunition capsules while the guns were still cooling from a bombardment. This turned logistics into tactics. The ability to maintain the offensive rhythm without interruption was what allowed the succession of operations such as Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Leyte, and Iwo Jima. No pauses, no retreats, no waiting for supplies to reach the battlefield. The supply was already there. Japan, on the other hand, has never conceived of such a system. Each operation required a return, each return days of navigation, and every day lost was a day that the Americans moved forward. The Japanese fleet operated in short cycles, with high risk and little room for maneuver. The Americans, on the other hand, operated with depth, prediction, and immediate replacement. Logistics was no longer a support. It became the plan. The USS Shasta, for example, was an ammunition repository capable of carrying 8,000 tons of projectiles of all calibers. Alongside it, tankers such as the USS Cimarron transferred more than 2 million liters of fuel per operation. Floating workshops repaired engines, propellers, and radio systems at sea. The sailors did not return home. The house came to them. The sea, which for Japan was a corridor of risks, for the United States has become a continuous factory. The analogy is not exaggerated. A factory moves with conveyors, segments, replenishment, and flow. And that's exactly what the American fleet became. A moving system where the ammunition capsule left Hastings, crossed rails to San Francisco, boarded a freighter, crossed the Pacific, was transferred to a carrier in the middle of the ocean, and finally reached the turrets of a cruiser without interrupting the combat operation. It was the absolute integration of rear and front line. The results were immediate. In campaigns such as the invasion of the Philippines, the American fleet sustained daily bombardments for weeks, without having to retreat. On Iwo Jima, warships fired more than 22,000 large-caliber shells in the first 5 days, all refueled on the high seas. On Okinawa, the replenishment cycle reached the point where each ship was replenished up to 3 times a week, ensuring constant coverage without loss of rhythm. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched kamikaze attacks because they could no longer supply aircraft carriers. The difference was visible, but more than that, it was strategic. The American fleet became ubiquitous. Where Japan expected to find attrition, it found reinforcement. Where he expected to find silence, he heard continuous shelling. War, for Americans, was a perpetual motion. Even German engineers, a world reference in innovation, were impressed by the American logistics data. After the war, during interrogations conducted by the Allied Technical Exploration Mission, a Kriegsmarine general stated, "What the Americans did was not build ships. It was building a system that turns ships into cogs in a floating power plant." This sentence sums up the error of perspective that defeated the Axis empires. While Germany and Japan thought about units, the United States thought about processes. And a process does not depend on luck, nor on tactical genius. It depends only on continuity, and that they guaranteed with rails, steel, capsules, and oil. But there was one more silent element in this ocean gear, the doctrine of overlap. While one operation was in progress, the next one was already being prepared. By June 1944, while Saipan was still burning under fire, the support ships of 10 Squadron were already moving supplies to Guam. By the time Guam had not yet been fully occupied, the first freighters of Operation Forager were already crossing to Leyte. Japan could not predict the next move because the American moves were simultaneous. Linear warfare had died. Network warfare was born. A war where capsules, fuel, and hot meals walked in front of the tanks. A war where the rear guard was faster than the front, and where the maps of the High Command became obsolete even before they were finalized. All of this was feasible for one reason: logistics planning anchored in infinite production. But where exactly did this brute force come from? How was it possible to maintain such a network, such fluidity, such redundancy, without exhausting resources? The answer lay in the industrial hearts of Hastings, Crane, and other factories that never seemed to shut down. And that's exactly what the next installment will reveal: how American capsules crisscross the country on unique tracks, escorted like diamonds, and how even the architecture of the warehouses was redesigned to serve the logic of a war that never accepted pause. On the deck of the battleship Yamato, Japanese officers adjusted optical rangefinder cranks with the ceremonial precision of a samurai ritual. Each shot involved a manual calculation, performed based on visual reading of the distance, target speed, and atmospheric corrections. It was a dance of trained eyes, naval logic, and experience. The Imperial Navy had perfected this system over decades. In exercises in the inland sea, gunners learned to rely on instinct, silence, and the cold metal of optical instruments. But in 1944, in the face of American forces, that method proved not only obsolete, but suicidal. On the other side, gun turrets operated by the Mark 37 system integrated radar, servo motors, gyroscopic stabilization, and analog firing computers. Distances were not measured by eyes, but by radio waves. The response time wasn't minutes, it was seconds. The radar, invisible and immune to darkness, pierced fog, smoke, and even artillery curtains. Where the Japanese esteemed it, the Americans knew. Where Japan guessed, the US calculated. The impact of this difference was brutal. In night battles, such as that of Surigao Strait, Japanese ships did not even see their targets before they were hit. Reports indicate that American battleships opened fire with precision from more than 30-kilometer away, something unthinkable for visual doctrines. On the other hand, the Japanese could only engage effectively below 18 kilometer, and even then with an increasing margin of error. An American ship equipped with the Mark 37 and FC-type radar could track, follow, and hit moving targets with greater than 80% accuracy, even at night. This made individual heroism irrelevant. It was no longer about who saw best, but about who saw first and farther. The Japanese mistake was not only technical, it was doctrinaire. Faith in tradition overcame the requirement of adaptation. Naval manuals still valued the gunner's vision as the pinnacle of effectiveness. And even with the late introduction of radars, such as the Types 21 and 22, the training did not keep up. Many commanders were suspicious of electronic systems. They preferred to rely on manual rangefinders, even in the face of evidence that they were operating blind. An internal Navy document from 1943 points out that radar is useful in some situations, but it never replaces the visual expertise of the fire direction officer. But this cultural resistance condemned entire ships to destruction without reaction. It was honor sinking along with efficiency. In the United States, the logic was the opposite. Tradition was not an end, but a starting point. If a machine could do better, it took over. The Mark 37 system was operated by a team trained in mathematics and physics, but aided by computers that adjusted the guns in real time. The towers moved by themselves. The radar data fed into the algorithms, which corrected the shot while it was still crossing the air. This integration of data and mechanics allowed American ships to maintain continuous fire even under evasive maneuvers, rough seas, or smoke screens. It was a war driven by numbers, not nerves. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota engaged Japanese ships with such precision that a Japanese officer, upon being captured, asked, "How did you know where we were, even without light?" The answer was simple: radar. Americans no longer depended on sight. The human eye, no matter how trained, did not compete with microwaves traveling at the speed of light. And this was reflected in the results. During the final campaigns, American ships hit their targets 4 times more accurately than their Japanese counterparts. And it wasn't for better aim. It was for a better system. For the Germans, who had developed radars even before the war began, American superiority in systems integration was astonishing. In interrogations conducted after the surrender, Kriegsmarine engineers admitted that the U.S. had surpassed Germany not in the invention of the systems, but in the ability to produce them at scale and train troops to use them in the field. One of them stated, "They didn't create the best radars, but they taught every sailor to trust them. That changes everything." American doctrine relied on the machine, and the machine delivered. Japan trusted the man, and the man no longer saw it. In addition to combat effectiveness, the Mark 37 system represented a new paradigm, that of automated warfare. The shooting command ceased to be an exercise in individual judgment and became a systemic process. This freed up commanders for strategic decisions, while the machine took care of the firing. What's more, it allowed young gunners with a few months of training to operate with almost professional precision. It was not necessary to have 20 years in the Navy to hit a ship 25 kilometers away. All you had to do was trust the interface. This leveling by technology created a Navy that functioned with less preparation time, more margin of success, and less emotional exhaustion. In contrast, the Japanese went into combat for fear of making mistakes. They knew that every capsule counted. They knew that each mistake compromised the stock. And worse, they knew that they had no way of seeing their enemy in adverse conditions. The doctrine, once elegant, had become cruel. The attachment to honor and naval tradition turned their ships into monuments to obsolescence. The war had changed pace, scale, and logic, and Japan could not keep up. But if the American sight was guided by radar, its impact was even more deadly because of an almost invisible innovation: the proximity fuse, a capsule that exploded on its own as it approached the target without the need for direct impact. A revolution that would forever change the battlefield, and that we will see in detail in the next part. As the skies of the Pacific became corridors of death, with bomber formations and kamikaze attacks in successive waves, American anti-aircraft artillery reached a new era, not of fire, but of calculation. In 1943, a silent, invisible and lethal weapon appeared: the proximity fuse. Unlike any previous system, this new type of projectile did not need to directly hit its target. It was enough to get closer. An internal radio field, activated by miniaturized sensors, detected the proximity of enemy aircraft. The explosion occurred at the exact moment when the damage would be maximum. Developed in absolute secrecy by the Johns Hopkins University Applied Research Laboratory, the proximity fuse was a quantum leap, an algorithm embedded in steel capsules. Each projectile began to think for itself. It was, literally, a machine that decided when to die to ensure that the enemy died with it. The impact was immediate. The hit rate of anti-aircraft artillery has increased by as much as 600%, where once it took hundreds of shots to bring down a plane, now fewer than 20 were enough. The explosions, once erratic, became surgical. Entire formations of Japanese bombers were decimated before they even approached the American fleets. In the account of an Imperial Navy pilot who survived an attack against the fleet on Okinawa, the confession was straightforward. It sounded like magic. Each explosion was placed as if someone was aiming with their hand. American artillery, which had previously frightened by volume, now terrified by its invisible accuracy. The skies became an invisible cage, and each capsule was the key to the trap. To develop this system, the US faced what seemed impossible, miniaturizing radio valves and creating circuits resistant to the impact of a cannon fire. This required materials engineering, shock physics, and precision electronics on an industrial scale. While the Japanese were still melting capsules from molten copper from temple bells, the Americans were producing projectiles with technology equivalent to small individual radars. By 1944, the Crosley Corporation's Cincinnati plant was producing up to 40,000 proximity fuses a day, each one tested, calibrated, and sent to naval stockpiles in less than 72 hours. Japan, for its part, did not even understand the principle of the weapon's operation. In intercepted reports after the war, Japanese officials described the explosions with terms such as divine intervention and magic weapon. The technological abyss became spiritual. The development of the proximity fuse also exposed the philosophical difference between the two empires. While Japan trained soldiers to die with honor and accurate aim, the US trained engineers to win with algorithms and sensors. War was no longer a duel between men. It became a competition between laboratories. In many ways, the Pacific engagements became the field tests of a new kind of conflict, one where victory was measured in automated accuracy rather than individual courage. A single American battleship, such as the USS New Jersey, equipped with 5-inch guns and proximity fuses, could neutralize entire air attacks without relying on visibility or human judgment. All you had to do was shoot, and the rest was calculation. In practice, this transformed American defense doctrine. Before, it was necessary to form a continuous curtain of fire to try to stop the attacks. It was now possible to select targets with brutal efficiency. In 1945, during the suicide attacks on Okinawa, more than 75% of the kamikaze aircraft that approached the US fleet were destroyed before they came within 3 kilometers of the space. Each capsule exploded at the exact moment, in the right space, against an enemy who could no longer understand what was happening. The Japanese response: intensify the sacrifice, send more planes, multiply death. But there was no human number that surpassed electronic calculation. This new paradigm has also reduced dependence on weather conditions. In storms, fog, night fighting, or in dense smoke, radar systems directed the shots, and the fuses decided when to explode. The process was continuous, systematic, and relentless. In many cases, American artillery didn't even know if it had hit until they saw the debris fall in flames from the sky. It was a war by delegation. The machine fired, the machine thought, the machine decided. And this caused perplexity in Axis intelligence reports. A German colonel captured in Normandy stated, "Their capsules have brains. Ours still have gunpowder and hope." It was the involuntary admission of an intellectual defeat, that technology had won out over tradition. And all this was only possible because, behind each shot, there was a network of factories, laboratories, and research centers operating in perfect synchrony. American power was not just in the capsule. It was in the ability to produce, distribute, and improve it in real time. While it took the Japanese weeks to adapt tactics to the new threats, the Americans adjusted circuits in days. Warfare had become iterative, like a line of code being optimized in the field. Every failure yesterday was a hit tomorrow, and each hit consolidated supremacy. But even with all of this, radar, computerized aiming, intelligent fuses, there was yet another invisible element that cemented American superiority: the ability to predict, not just react. An intelligence, decoding, and analysis system that allowed the US to know where, when, and how the enemy would move, because the perfect capsule is useless if it is fired in the wrong place. And what Japan never knew is that in addition to shooting more, the Americans knew before. And that's what we'll see in the next part. On June 19, 1944, the sky over the Philippine Sea was no longer just a battlefield. It became a laboratory where the sheer power of American logistics finally met the complete collapse of Japanese strategy. It was the beginning of the so-called Battle of the Philippine Sea, an air-naval offensive that would not be remembered for fleet movements or tactical maneuvering, but for a simple image: the sky being obliterated by a wall of fire. Over the course of a single day, the US Navy fired more than 1 million 20mm shells at waves of enemy planes. 1 million. A single destroyer, the USS Stockholm, recorded more than 12,000 40mm rounds in less than 18 hours. The explosions were so constant, so synchronized, that officials report that the sound seemed continuous, like that of a steel factory operating non-stop. That's right. The battlefield had turned into a death production line. And the Japanese had no way to respond. No training, no coverage, no radars. Each plane launched into the air was a funeral counting down. The American doctrine was showing its climax. It was no longer about aiming at planes. It was about neutralizing the entire sky. The curtain of fire formed by dozens of warships, all operating automated radar, sighting and proximity fuses, turned the airspace into forbidden territory. The radar detected, the Mark 37 calculated, the fuses decided. The result, what the Japanese Navy itself baptized with a funereal tone, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the great slaughter of the Marianas. Never before in modern history have so many planes been destroyed in such a short time. It is estimated that more than 600 Japanese aircraft were shot down in 2 days, not because of hunting superiority, not by maneuvers, but by the sum of capsules, electronic logic, and an industry that did not know the verb stop. The most impressive thing is that Japan still believed at that moment that it would be able to balance the scales. The plan of attack included the use of deflated aircraft carriers, floating only to draw fire. But the Americans, with their intelligence and aerial surveillance system, identified the decoy even before the fighters took off. The result was a technical massacre. Japanese pilots, many with less than 20 hours of flight time, faced off against trained veterans with thousands of live rounds during exercises. Some reports indicate that less than 10% of enemy pilots returned, and among those who returned, many had not even been able to locate the American fleet, hidden by the range of radars and the intensity of the anti-aircraft defense. Let's pause for a fact that exposes the abyss. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea alone, the US fired more anti-aircraft ammunition than the entire Japanese production of medium-caliber capsules in 1943. A single battle surpassed 12 months of industrial effort. If this statistic impressed you, comment below with "logistics wins," because that's what happened. The war was not won at sea. It was beaten on the assembly conveyor belt that never stopped sending projectiles. And the ships, which operated so constantly, still had refueling scheduled for the next day. Nothing was improvised. Every load of ammunition, every fuel, every spare part was accounted for, positioned, and delivered with mathematical precision. The American war was predictable because it was systematic, and that is why, at the end of the battle, the US still had full capacity to continue fighting, while Japan had practically exhausted its naval aviation. The Imperial Air Fleet would never be the same again. Not because of a defeat, but because there were no more planes, no more pilots, no capsules to sustain the illusion of combat. Officers of the German Kriegsmarine, as they studied the reports of the battle months later, were shocked. One wrote, "If this is true, then we lost not because of tactical error, but because of failure to understand what modern warfare was." This phrase is the confession that sums up the 20th century. Those who did not understand the industry did not understand the war. But the abyss did not end in heaven. There was another battlefield where the capsule counted, and where the Americans also crushed any possibility of response. A field in which the projectiles did not fly, but dug, and where the most important shot came not from a cannon, but from a shovel, a rail, and a supply line. Because after saturating the skies, the US would saturate the beaches, with explosives, armor, trucks, and heavy artillery, all stacked and numbered like supermarket pieces, and that's exactly what we'll reveal in the next part, the war for tonnage, where winning simply meant being able to land more capsules than the enemy could destroy. On the morning of April 6, 1945, the inland sea of Japan witnessed the departure of a vessel that represented everything the empire still dared to call glory. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, set sail for its final mission, a suicidal assault against American forces on Okinawa. It was an operation with no return. There was not enough fuel for the return, and more alarmingly, there was no ammunition for a protracted battle. The vessel that symbolized the pinnacle of Japanese naval pride left the port carrying literally all of the country's remaining stock of heavy ammunition. His destiny was not to win, it was to die with noise. But even that would be denied him. With its 4 60mm main guns, the Yamato could fire nearly 1.5-ton shells from more than 40 kilometers away. Each shot cost months of casting, polishing, transporting, and preparing. However, on board, there was enough ammunition for only a few bursts. In practice, its anti-aircraft artillery, the only real line of defense against the impending attack, had the capacity for 12 minutes of continuous fire. 12, not by choice, but by collapse. Japan had exhausted its reserves of capsules, and even the largest war machine ever placed on the oceans was forced to sail like a floating temple, full of ritual, empty of force. At 12:20 p.m. that day, the first wave of American planes appeared on the horizon. There were dozens, then hundreds. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, each carrying bombs, torpedoes, and 50 shell casings fired with uninterrupted accuracy. The Yamato, while colossal, had no adequate escort. Their radars, primitive and ineffective, offered no real advance warning. By the time the first torpedoes touched the hull, the gunners were already at the limit of their response capacity. The shots were sparse, manual, erratic. The anti-aircraft artillery, lagging both in quantity and technology, could neither repel nor disorganize enemy formations. By 2:23 p.m., the ship had already been hit by at least a dozen torpedoes and more than 10 heavy bombs. The crew fought with what they had, which was little. Most of the auxiliary guns were silent. Some sectors no longer responded, not because of damage, but because of lack of ammunition. The capsule that was supposed to be there simply did not exist. One survivor reported, "I was in the aft sector when the last loader shouted, 'It's over. Not damaged ammunition, not locked ammo. It's over.'" The Yamato, the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, became an immovable target. No firing capability, no speed to maneuver, no air cover, no hope. At 2:47 p.m., an internal explosion, caused by a direct hit on the ammunition magazines, tore the battleship in half. The bang was so intense that it could be heard from 200 kilometers away. Nearly 3,000 sailors died, many without ever having managed to fire a single capsule at the enemy. The largest ship in the world sank without having fulfilled its mission, not out of cowardice, not because of incompetence, but because Japan, at that point in the war, could no longer sustain its weapons. The capsule had become rarer than the ship that fired it. The industrial war does not spare monuments. In the United States, news of Yamato's destruction was greeted with respect and a quiet understanding of its irony. Intelligence analysts highlighted a telling point. The battleship had not been sunk by another ship. It was defeated exclusively by mass-produced planes and capsules, fired by trained pilots with thousands of live rounds, guided by doctrines based on saturation and efficiency. The greatest symbol of traditional warfare, founded without even seeing its enemy up close. And perhaps this was the cruelest epitaph for the Imperial Navy. It prepared a machine for a type of warfare that no longer existed. If in 1941 the Yamato represented the vanguard of Japanese power, in 1945 it had become a steel museum, displaced in time. It was too big to run away, too slow to react, and too dependent on capsules that didn't exist. The doctrine that built the ship did not foresee shortages. It did not provide for radar. It did not provide for aerial refueling. And above all, he did not foresee losing to cheap capsules launched by planes lighter than their cannons. Japanese superiority, refined, concentrated, elitist, has been swallowed up by American efficiency, distributed, constant, impersonal. Years later, in interrogations conducted with German Navy officers, the story of the Yamato was often mentioned as a tragic example of what happens when you build strength without sustain. A Kriegsmarine commander stated, "You won because you knew how many capsules you had before you designed your ships. We and the Japanese have built ships for our past glories. You built capsules for tomorrow." But if the Yamato sank due to lack of capsules, there is another side of the coin that needs to be revealed. The place where the capsules were left, were discarded, reused, and even buried because they were so abundant. A place where the production of ammunition was so vast that the numbers seemed fictitious. And it is this place, almost mythological for Japan, that will be the focus of the next part. The city that became ammunition. Hastings. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Leyte, Philippines, a group of small American ships found themselves face to face with the largest remaining Japanese surface force. It was the Battle of Samar, an encounter that, at first glance, seemed doomed. On one side, light destroyers, escort carrier escorts, smaller ships armed with 5-inch turrets, and crews that had barely been tested under live fire. On the other, heavy battleships, long-range cruisers, and Japanese destroyers equipped to pulverize any vessel in their path. The difference wasn't just one of tonnage, it was one of concept. But the Americans had two weapons that the Japanese could not replicate: logistical reliability and abundant ammunition. The USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, charged at the enemy fleet without hesitation. Its commander, Ernest Evans, knew he wouldn't win by size. He would win by persistence. The ship fired more than 200 5-inch shells in continuous bursts against cruisers, such as the Kumano and the Suzuya. It combined evasive maneuvers with precision strikes, launching torpedoes and opening fire as if it were the last day of combat. Because maybe it was. But even under the weight of the impending sacrifice, there was one silent certainty on deck. Ammunition was not a problem. The tank was full. And if they survived, another ship, another convoy, another depot would guarantee more capsules to continue. The Samuel B. Roberts, still smaller, operated as an escort destroyer, an escort ship, technically unsuitable for direct engagements with battleships. But American doctrine was never about what could be done theoretically. It was about what you did with what you had. The Roberts dove against the enemy at 32 knots, opening fire at 9,500 yards. In a matter of minutes, it had fired more than 600 127mm shells, almost half of its total arsenal. The cadence was so intense that the sailors in the turrets were forced to manually change the gun covers due to overheating. There was no saving, there was no caution. The ammunition, abundant, allowed for boldness. It was courage, fueled by the certainty of refueling. And therein lay the fundamental difference. American ships did not hesitate to fire. They didn't count cartridges. They did not measure aggressiveness. They knew that each capsule could be replaced, and it would be. It was David, with a backpack full of stones, facing proud, heavy Goliaths, and empty. On the other side, even with greater firepower, the Japanese commanders hesitated. They knew that each projectile was irreplaceable, that a second wave of combat might not exist. And hesitation in naval combat is the difference between hitting or being sunk. It is important to understand that the bravery of the Johnston and Roberts crew members was not born out of desperation. It was born from the system, from the technical knowledge that behind that ship was a support network that stretched to the depots in Nebraska, to the Hastings tracks, to the Pacific convoys. They were not alone. They were connected to a logistical empire that turned every local action into part of a global offensive. When they fired, they weren't just using capsules. They were triggering the logic of a full-scale war. The Imperial Japanese Navy itself was stunned by the American response. Reports indicate that several commanders underestimated the small destroyers. They imagined that they would be easy targets, but they underestimated not the courage, they underestimated the ammunition. A Japanese cruiser, after receiving dozens of hits from the Johnston, had to retreat with serious structural damage. Another was hit by a volley that damaged his communication system. It wasn't just precision, it was volume, saturation, persistence. The Roberts was eventually sunk, yes. But before that, it contributed decisively to stopping the Japanese offensive, a theoretically overwhelming force, forced to retreat because of ships that, in traditional logic, should have been destroyed in minutes. The US Navy didn't win that battle because it had the best ships. It won because its smallest ships had ammunition to fight as if they were the largest. And this concept, which seems simple, was incomprehensible to the Japanese and to the Germans. A Kriegsmarine report analyzing the Pacific clashes coolly acknowledged the point. The difference between what is possible to build and what is possible to sustain determines victory. If the capsule is limited, bravery is a waste. But if the capsule is constant, even bravery becomes multiplying. The most ironic thing is that American industry did not see these ships as exceptional. They were part of a pattern. The stock of capsules was always anticipated to exceed the need. Overshooting was part of the training. The doctrine said, "Did you make a mistake, shoot again. The right will come by volume, not hesitation." It was a philosophy that freed the combatant from the fear of making mistakes, and thus allowed him to make fewer mistakes. The capsule became, at the same time, a weapon and a psychological shield. And while the United States allowed a light ship to become a hero for what it had to spare, Japan buried its battleships in silence, not for lack of will, but for lack of capsules. The difference between the hero and the monument was in logistics. But the war, at that time, still had one more trump card, because it was not enough to supply the ships with capsules. It was necessary to ensure that each capsule was lethal, even when the enemy was in full swing. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next installment, how the Americans turned their projectiles into autonomous death machines, using one of the most advanced secret technologies of the war, fuse intelligence. Silently, at the bottom of the Pacific, rest 147 Japanese ships loaded with capsules that have never been fired. They were convoys of ammunition, crucial supplies, survival lines for an increasingly resource-hungry fleet. But war was no longer fought with cannons alone. It moved in the holds of freighters, in the compartments of auxiliary vessels, in the invisible rails that supported combat weapons. And it was precisely then that the United States decided to strike with surgical precision, using one of the most effective and discreet weapons of its strategy, the submarine force. From the first year of the conflict, the U.S. Navy understood that destroying warships was less efficient than choking their supply chain. The logic was simple. An enemy cruiser without ammunition was just a metallic silhouette over the water. Between 1942 and 1945, American submarines sank more than 500,000 tons of Japanese ammunition before it could be delivered to frontline units. Every capsule lost on the seabed was a shot that could never be fired. The Japanese doctrine of saving resources became useless when the resource did not even reach the battlefield. An emblematic example was the attack by the USS Wahoo in October 1943. Operating in the waters off the Tsushima Strait, the submarine identified a large ammunition freighter. With a volley of torpedoes, he hit the target squarely. The explosion was so massive that it was recorded more than 40 nautical miles away. The flash lit up the night sky for more than 30 seconds. Observers initially believed it was the explosion of a coastal deposit. It was, in fact, a floating capsule, an entire city of shells, evaporating in seconds. These attacks were not random. They were part of a methodical, calculated campaign, fueled by intercepted intelligence and logistical statistics. With each ship sunk, the Imperial Navy retreated one more step in its offensive capacity. In 1944, American intelligence estimates indicated that Japan operated with only 15% of the minimum ammunition needed to maintain sustained operations on 3 fronts. Gunners were given explicit orders to avoid long shots. Captains were hesitant to engage in night combat, and bombings were cancelled due to lack of 20mm shells. It was no longer the American cruiser that was the real enemy. It was absence. The impacts were piling up. Japanese officials reported that capsules were repackaged and reused up to 4 times, dismantled and reconditioned by hand by makeshift crews. Many exploded in the pipe. Others failed to reach their target. Quality standards have collapsed, replaced by a desperate urgency to keep stocks visible, even if unusable. Some advanced islands have begun to manufacture homemade projectiles, smelting local metal without ballistic accuracy. They were symbolic weapons, shots of hope. Meanwhile, the United States did the opposite. For every capsule launched into the sea by the Japanese without ever having been used, a new era was produced on American industrial lines, tested, packed, transported, and delivered directly to the deck of a ship. The proportion became obscene. In 1945, the Americans launched more than 50,000 capsules a day in the Central Pacific alone. It was the equivalent of Japan's monthly consumption. If an American capsule failed, it was no problem. Another would be used. If one ship was hit, another would replace it. The war had become a flow equation. The irony of this story is that Japan didn't need any more courage. I needed capsules. But no amount of heroism beats the mathematical absence of projectiles. And if you're enjoying unraveling these hidden gears behind the front, like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you technical, historical, and human content with this level of detail. It is his support that transforms cold data into living narratives. In the end, what sank the Imperial Navy was not only the direct action of the American fleet. It was the progressive absence of live ammunition, the erosion of combat power before ships even saw the enemy. The capsule, transformed into a luxury good, shaped high command decisions. A Japanese destroyer refused to engage in combat against an inferior American force. The reason? Only 30% of its anti-aircraft ammunition was available. One cruiser retreated after firing less than a third of its guns. The rest was old ammunition, considered unstable. Once again, war is no longer about bravery. It became about logistical spreadsheets. Japan had soldiers, it had officers, it had vessels. But it had no capsules, and against a firing machine like the American one, this was the same as having no army at all. But there is a detail that has not yet been revealed. Because even with all this industrial, logistical, and technological advantage, the United States had one final trump card, a production capacity that wasn't just big, it was mobile. And in the next part, we'll find out how the Americans put entire factories to sail, turning ships into floating depots and creating the concept of real-time, replenished warfare. On the deck of a Japanese cruiser in 1944, the silence between shots said more than any command order. It was not the absence of targets. It was the mental calculations that preceded each shot. The scorer, eyes fixed on his sights, hesitated. His finger was not guided only by aim, but by the awareness of scarcity. Each capsule that came out of the cannon was, perhaps, one that could not be replaced. It was what turned the Japanese war into an emotional chess game. Every move had to be justified, every shot morally assessed, strategically weighed. And on the battlefield, this kind of mental warfare is a death sentence. What the war manuals of the time called fire discipline became, in practice, a doctrinal poison. Japanese gunners spent hours in readiness, waiting for the perfect order, the ideal moment. But the ideal moment rarely came. By the time it appeared, it was too late. An internal Imperial Navy report revealed that in several battles, opening shots were delayed not by technical failure, but by fear of waste. The capsule was treated as sacred art, inviolable, precious, irreproducible. Instead of a weapon, it has become a logistical fetish. The effect was devastating. During night attacks, gunners would stop firing for fear of revealing their position. In close-range clashes, they calculated too much. The obsession with the efficient use of the stock overtook the survival instinct. The capsule ceased to be an instrument of victory and became a symbol of a deeper fear, that of being without it. A Japanese lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We fired only when the chance of a hit was absolute, but war does not offer absolutes, only probabilities." This search for perfection imposed by scarcity killed effectiveness. In the United States, the logic was the opposite. Training manuals encouraged error as part of the process. Wrong. Shoot again. The capsule was a tool for learning, repetition, saturation. Live fire drills used thousands of shells per session. Moving targets, night simulations, practice trailers. Shooting was a constant, never an exception. An American instructor even stated, "Our goal is for the gunner to feel more comfortable pulling the trigger than holding the finger." This created a mindset of readiness, a fluidity of response. This contrast was reflected in the reports of combat. In similar engagements, the American batteries responded with bursts of volume. The Japanese, with studied pauses, often hesitant. It was not cowardice. It was logistical conditioning. The fear of waste curbed the fire instinct, and, ironically, it led to even more waste. Because the right moment was often the first, and the first, almost always, was lost. A post-war study of the Allied forces looked at the behavior of Japanese anti-aircraft batteries compared to American ones. Conclusion: the average response time to first visual contact was 9 seconds longer on Japanese ships. It may seem little, but at 300 knots, an airplane crosses almost 1,500 meters in that time. It is the difference between hitting the bomber still on approach or seeing it drop its charges on the deck. Every second lost was a projectile saved, one that cost dozens of lives. And it was not just about doctrine, it was a culture of internalized scarcity. The capsule began to carry not only gunpowder, but guilt, responsibility, fear. A mistake with her was punished not with rebuke, but with the weight of conscience. Officers distributed booklets that instructed gunners on when not to fire. The war was conducted with a handbrake on, a battle for internal permission. Meanwhile, on the American side, the capsule was seen as an available, routine, abundant resource. They fired at dubious targets, shadows, noises. Better to err on the side of excess than to hesitate on the fly. This culture of reliance on supply translated into psychological superiority. The American fighter shot without fear of missing. The Japanese, even hitting it, shot in fear. And this kind of pressure undermines the initiative, the aggressiveness, the fluidity of war. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a glaring example illustrated this imbalance. A Japanese cruiser was targeted by more than 200 shells before it was able to respond with an effective firing. Its gunners were waiting for the ideal moment, which never came. In the end, the moment was taken by the Americans, not for precision, but for abundance. Volume overcame caution. The excess won the calculation. U.S. naval intelligence reports reveal that in 1945, the Japanese even distributed capsules with a warning of restricted use to critical emergency, but never clearly defined what this emergency was. The result, no one wanted to be the first to pull the trigger. Scarcity turned into paralysis. Paralysis in defeat, and defeat in default. It is at this point that the war changes form. It ceases to be a conflict of nations and becomes a competition between mentalities. One of them said, "Shoot wisely, because there will be no second chance." The other said, "Shoot until it works, because there's always going to be a next capsule." The first stifled boldness, the second freed, and history chose which one would win. If the Japanese capsule was a burden, the American was an extension of the will. And this difference, invisible on the maps, shaped what happened on the seas. But the war still held a last layer of inequality. Because more than shooting without fear, Americans were about to shoot without seeing, using technology to aim where the eyes failed. In the next part, we will reveal how the revolution of automatic firing systems sealed the supremacy of the skies and the sea. Amid the silent villages of the Japanese countryside, a sound echoed with suppressed sadness, the last ring of a temple bell being lifted from its wooden pavilion. Monks watched without protest. Children looked on without understanding. The bell, which for centuries had marked the seasons, rites, and funerals, would now be melted down, converted into artillery capsules. The order had come from the high command. Every non-essential bell was to be handed over. Copper was urgent. And what was once a spiritual symbol of permanence became disposable raw material for a war that could no longer be won. In less than 2 years, more than 90% of Japan's Buddhist bells have been melted down. It is estimated that more than 67,000 pieces have disappeared, some with more than 1,000 years of history. The bells became ammunition, but the ammunition was not enough. A capsule made with the bronze of a sacred bell lasted a maximum of 7 seconds in combat. It was fired, exploded, and disappeared into the void. The echo of the final touch remained. An 11-year-old boy in Nara wrote in his school diary, "Today they took our bell. He had been playing for 217 years. The temple is mute." It was not just a logistical act. It was a cultural amputation. Japan, suffocated by scarcity, began to dissolve itself. Bronze statues were torn from squares. Ornamental gates have lost their details. Historic vases have disappeared from schools. Even voluntary donations of familiar objects became commonplace. Cutlery, glasses, tea bells. The whole society was mobilized to produce capsules. The war consumed even the soul of the country. In each city, copper ceased to be art. It became war debris. In each village, memory was fused with urgency. But even this faith-driven effort has not had a strategic impact. A report from the Japanese Ministry of Industry, dated October 1944, admitted the output obtained from the casting of bells represents less than 4% of the actual need for capsules per month. The empire of the rising sun melted centuries of history to ensure 2 days of fire on a battlefront. The disproportion was devastating, and yet it was the only visible path. The government called this a sacred sacrifice, but in practice it was institutionalized despair. On the other side of the Pacific, while bells became capsules in Japan, capsules were left over in the USA. American factories, at the peak of production, generated 20,000 capsules per hour. At Hastings, a production line rejected more ammunition per day than Japan produced in a week. American rejection was, for the Japanese, an unthinkable luxury. What was discarded in the United States as imperfect would be celebrated in Japan as the final product. The irony of war was now set in bronze. The enemy sacrificed temples for capsules. But what came out of the capsule was little, and what was lost with the bell was a lot. At the front, soldiers began to recognize capsules with distinct metallic tones. Some were more opaque, others brighter. The engineers noticed the purer alloy of the ancient bells generated slightly more accurate shots, but also more fragile. They fragmented into fewer splinters. They exploded before their time. The capsule made with cultural soul did not have the performance of the capsule made with modern industry. It was a cruel symbol. Even in ammunition, Japanese history died useless. And what seemed heroic at first, the collective sacrifice, the spiritual surrender, has turned into a moral burden. The monks, who had previously blessed the bell removal trains, began to refuse the ceremonies. One of them told the local press, "They took away our past to fabricate a future that does not exist." The phrase did not reach the high command, but it reached the children. In school diaries, records about silence multiplied. "Today the temple didn't ring. My grandfather cried when they took the bell away. Now we only hear the planes." The bell, once the center of community life, had been replaced by the roar of capsules that barely reached the enemy. And even with this cultural mobilization, Japanese production could not keep up with the pace of consumption. A field report indicated that, to maintain the pace of firing of the surface fleet, 800,000 shells per month would be needed. In 1945, Japan produced about 90,000, less than 12% of the actual need. Each capsule came out of a millennial bell and was gone in seconds. The logistical calculation became a spiritual calculation. How much of the national soul is worth spending to keep up with the noise of war? Japan bet that its people would endure everything, hunger, silence, mourning, to keep shooting. But modern warfare required more than spirit. It required steel, rails, electricity. It required volume. And the volume Japan has never had. The symbolic gesture remained. The capsule became a relic. The shot, prayer. But no religion resists mathematics, and what the temples gave, the seas took. In the end, the sacred copper capsule was no more lethal than the industrial iron one, and the firing of a millennial bell had no more impact than that of an American factory. It was the final proof that faith, no matter how profound, does not win a modern war alone. The Japanese capsule was made with devotion, the American with method, and this difference echoed not only on the battlefield, but in the very memory of the war. But not every symbol was melted down. A single bell, preserved by monks who refused to hand it over, would years later be offered as a gift of peace to the American general who commanded the occupation. The capsule that was not fired became a symbol of the end. And the sound that did not play in 1945 would sound again in 1952, marking the silence of a nation defeated, not by bombs, but by spreadsheets. In the next part, we'll descend into the basements where these numbers were born. The US military's production engineering offices, where capsules were not only manufactured, but designed as part of a chain of invincibility. Long before the first torpedoes crossed the Pacific, the war was already mathematically decided. In 1942, as Japan celebrated the conquest of territories and sank Allied ships with tactical precision, the United States sealed the fate of the conflict with silent numbers. American copper production alone surpassed all Japanese military consumption in armaments, communications, electronics, and ammunition. In a single quarter, the US mined more copper than Japan had available for the entire year. But it wasn't just the volume, it was the quality. American capsules weren't just more numerous, they were better. Cast with purer alloys, treated with thermal stabilization processes, tested with minimal error tolerance. Each one underwent automated inspection. In Japan, verification was still manual. In Japan, each capsule was an effort. In the United States, it was a statistic. The American War Department knew. The War Production Board's reports, sent to the Pentagon as early as 1942, indicated that the production levels of ammunition, steel, vehicles, and equipment were sufficient to sustain multiple fronts indefinitely. Every new ship launched, every new shipment of capsules sent, was not just reinforcement, it was confirmation. Mathematicians in the Budget Office predicted U.S. industrial capacity exceeds that of the Axis tenfold and will double in the next 18 months. The document has been classified, but it wasn't necessary. Just look at what came out of the Hastings tracks. The sheds that housed the projectile production line had no aesthetics, but they were accurate. The average time between the start of the casting and the storage of a finished capsule was 47 minutes. Every 1.2 seconds, a new 40mm capsule was finished. While Japan cast bells in ceremony, the Americans cast steel as if making screws. And in fact, in many cases, the same factories produced capsules and civilian parts within minutes of difference between the lines. It was the total fusion of economics and war. The so-called arsenal of democracy was not propaganda. It was applied engineering on a continental scale. One piece of data illustrates the structural superiority. For every 127mm capsule produced by Japan in 1943, the United States produced 118. And this number did not even include inventories. In other words, the naval war fought in the Pacific was like a duel between an army that carried cartridges in leather pouches and another that built new weapons during the firefight. When an American battleship fired at a Japanese target, the end result was less about aim and more about replacement. The Japanese couldn't absorb the difference because they didn't have the numbers, and those who did, they ignored it. This is where the final irony is revealed. In January 1944, the Japanese General Staff received an internal report estimating American production of capsules and ammunition. The number was considered exaggerated and psychologically destabilizing. The document was archived. Some officials suggested it was war propaganda. It wasn't. They were only looking for the first time at the true nature of the enemy, and they couldn't accept it. While kamikaze pilots were trained to carry explosives with their own bodies, the Americans tested radio-guided capsules. While Japan trained gunners with 30 practice shots, the United States simulated combat with 5,000 rounds per unit per week. The discrepancy was so deep that it didn't feel like a war. It felt like an uneven simulation between different eras. The Japanese problem was not only shortages, it was the denial of scarcity. Doctrine, culture, pride, everything conspired to maintain the illusion that it would be enough to fight harder. But the war of the 20th century was no longer about will. It was about production cadence, about the efficiency of the line, about the reliability of transportation. It was about knowing that the next ship wouldn't come with courage. It would come with 12,000 spare capsules, and that the next production shift was already underway. Perhaps the most accurate phrase about the conflict was recorded by a U.S. Army civil engineer responsible for quality control at Hastings. He said, "We don't make capsules. We manufactured minutes of victory. Each projectile that came out of the wake was one more instant of superiority, one more space in time when the enemy would not be able to react." The war became that. A succession of minutes in which only one side could keep shooting. And even in the face of the numbers, Japan continued to fight. He continued to cast bells. He continued emptying warehouses. He kept firing accurately, but that was not enough. No more. Because modern war is not decided by the bullet it hits, but by the certainty that there will always be another one ready. And in this, the United States had no rivals. In the next part, we come to the last capsule, the human, psychological, and historical impact of facing an enemy that not only wins, but overwins. We will hear the very accounts of the Japanese soldiers who, in the face of the storm of steel, understood that they were not just losing the war. They were witnessing the collapse of an era. When Japanese Captain Hara wrote in his diary that the Americans fired without thinking, while we counted each shot, he wasn't just describing a combat scene, he was epitomizing the collapse of an entire doctrine. This phrase became the epitaph of a model of warfare based on honor, scarcity, and hope. The Imperial Navy fought bravely. His men died with discipline. Their ships sank firing accurately. But none of these virtues prevented the advance of the enemy, who did not have to choose between courage and capsules, because he had both and in excess. Japan was defeated by one factory, for an extra shift in Hastings, by silent, invisible, constant logistical tracks. The enemy was not the American ship ahead. It was the ammunition train arriving behind it. The lesson of this war, brutal in its clarity, is that no strategy survives scarcity. No tactic can stand up to the volume. No doctrine based on saving ammunition can defeat a system that turns ore into ammunition before the enemy can react. The mistake was not military. It was arithmetic. And he repeated himself until the last shot. As one German officer captured in Normandy summed it up when he saw the Allied depots after D-Day, "We trained for accuracy. They won with trucks." If this story has impacted you, support the search for more forgotten truths, like subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Comment here, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.